The world watches Ukraine. Russia invaded in 2022. Hopes of a swift victory faded. The conflict escalated. NATO countries provided Ukraine with weapons. Economic sanctions targeted Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin made veiled threats. He hinted at using nuclear weapons. The world fears a wider war. The stakes are higher than ever. Experts debate Russia's nuclear doctrine. Some argue it's a defensive measure. Others believe it allows for escalation. Putin might use tactical nuclear weapons. He could target Ukrainian military positions, or he might strike a symbolic target. The goal would be to break Western resolve. Such an act would be unprecedented. It would shatter decades of nuclear taboo. The consequences are difficult to predict. Much depends on the scale and target. A limited strike might not trigger a nuclear response. NATO would face immense pressure to act. Public opinion would demand a response, but a full-scale nuclear war is unlikely. Both sides understand the concept of MAD. Mutual assured destruction prevents escalation, but miscalculation is always a risk. The situation remains tense and unpredictable. The world waits with bated breath. Diplomacy has failed to de-escalate the conflict. The risk of nuclear war is higher than in decades. The international community must work together. We need to find a peaceful resolution. The alternative is too terrible to contemplate. The use of nuclear weapons would be catastrophic. The immediate impact would be devastating. Thousands, if not millions, would die instantly. The blast radius would level entire cities. Radiation sickness would claim countless more lives. The long-term effects are just as horrifying. Cancer rates would skyrocket. The environment would be poisoned for generations. The psychological impact would be profound. The world would be gripped by fear. The trauma of the event would linger. Trust between nations would erode further. The international order would be shaken to its core. The specter of nuclear annihilation would return. It would be a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for self-destruction. Beyond the immediate devastation lies a global crisis. Nuclear winter is a chilling possibility. Dust and smoke would block out the sun, temperatures would plummet, leading to a global famine. Crops would fail and mass starvation would ensue. The delicate balance of the ecosystem would be disrupted. The consequences for humanity are too dire to comprehend. The use of nuclear weapons is not a military option. It is an act of barbarity. It would represent a failure of diplomacy and reason. The international community must condemn any such action. We must work tirelessly to prevent this scenario. The future of humanity hangs in the balance. NATO faces an impossible dilemma. A measured response is crucial. Overreaction could lead to escalation, but inaction would embolden Putin. It would undermine NATO's credibility. The alliance must find a middle ground. A calibrated response is essential. Military options are on the table. NATO could strengthen its presence in Europe. Deploying more troops to Eastern Europe is possible. Providing Ukraine with advanced weaponry is another option, but direct military intervention is unlikely. NATO wants to avoid a wider war with Russia. Economic sanctions would be the West's primary weapon. Russia would face crippling economic isolation. Access to international finance would be severed. Exports of key commodities would be blocked. The goal would be to cripple the Russian economy. But sanctions take time to have an effect. Diplomacy must remain a priority. Back channels for communication are essential. Finding a negotiated settlement is paramount, but trust between the parties is low. The prospects for a diplomatic solution seem bleak, yet dialogue is the only way to prevent further escalation. Retaliation seems inevitable, but the form it takes is uncertain. A proportional response is the most likely scenario. NATO might target Russian military assets. Conventional strikes on Russian soil are possible, but a nuclear response is highly unlikely. The risks of escalation are too high. A nuclear exchange would be catastrophic. It would result in millions of deaths. The environmental consequences would be devastating. The world would be plunged into a nuclear winter. Rational actors understand this. MAD remains a powerful deterrent, yet the potential for miscalculation exists. Emotions would be running high, pressure to respond would be immense, misinformation and misjudgment could occur. A small incident could spiral out of control. This is the danger of nuclear brinkmanship. The world holds its breath. The stakes have never been higher. The decisions made in the coming days will have lasting consequences. The future of humanity hangs in the balance. We can only hope that cooler heads prevail. Section 5, a world remade. The geopolitical landscape would be forever changed. The post-Cold War order would lie in ruins. Trust between nations would evaporate. The world would become a more dangerous place, international cooperation would be difficult, the global economy would plunge into chaos, supply chains would be disrupted, energy prices would skyrocket, financial markets would crash, a global recession would be inevitable, the economic fallout would be felt for years. The humanitarian crisis would be unprecedented, millions would be displaced from their homes, refugee flows would overwhelm neighboring countries, food shortages would lead to famine, the need for humanitarian aid would be dire. The world would struggle to cope with the aftermath. The threat of nuclear war would loom large. The scars of the conflict would run deep. Rebuilding trust and cooperation would be a long and arduous process. Section 6. The Fog of War. Information warfare would intensify. Propaganda and disinformation would spread. Each side would blame the other. Public opinion would be swayed by narratives. The truth would be difficult to discern. Cyberattacks would become commonplace. Critical infrastructure would be targeted. Power grids, communication networks, and financial institutions would be vulnerable. The goal would be to sow chaos and disruption. Espionage and covert operations would increase. Intelligence agencies would work overtime. The race to gather information would be paramount. Understanding the enemy's intentions would be crucial. The fog of war would descend. Uncertainty and paranoia would reign. The line between truth and fiction would blur. Making sound decisions would be challenging. The risk of miscalculation would be ever present. Section 7. The Ghosts of Hiroshima. The world remembers Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The horrors of nuclear war are etched in our minds. The images of devastation serve as a warning. We must never forget the lessons of the past. The use of nuclear weapons is not a victory. It is a defeat for humanity. It represents the failure of diplomacy and reason. We must find a better way to resolve our differences. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is crucial. It aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. It promotes nuclear disarmament and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. We must strengthen this treaty and its enforcement. The international community must work together. We need to reduce nuclear arsenals. We must prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We must promote dialogue and diplomacy. The alternative is unthinkable. A nuclear detonation would trigger a new arms race. Countries would feel pressure to acquire nuclear weapons. They would see it as a guarantee of security. The taboo against nuclear weapons would weaken. Regional powers would be tempted to develop their own nuclear arsenals. They would seek to deter their rivals. The risk of regional nuclear conflicts would increase. The world would become a much more dangerous place. The existing nuclear powers would modernize their arsenals. They would develop more advanced and deadly weapons. The focus would shift to tactical nuclear weapons. These are designed for battlefield use. Their use would be more likely. The world would enter a new era of nuclear danger. The risk of nuclear war would increase significantly. The consequences would be catastrophic for humanity. We must prevent this from happening. The world would live in the shadow of nuclear war. The threat of annihilation would be ever present. International relations would be strained. Trust would be in short supply. A fragile peace would prevail. Countries would be wary of each other. Military buildups would continue. The risk of miscalculation and accidents would increase. The world would be a tinderbox waiting to ignite. International organizations would struggle to maintain order. The United Nations would be divided. The Security Council would be paralyzed. Global governance would be weakened. The international order would be in disarray. The world would be a more dangerous and uncertain place. The threat of nuclear war would hang over humanity. The consequences of such a conflict would be catastrophic. We must find a way to prevent this from happening. The nature of warfare would be forever changed. Nuclear weapons would cast a long shadow. Conventional warfare would become less likely. The risks of escalation would be too great. Cyber warfare and information warfare would take center stage. These methods of conflict are less risky. They offer the potential for deniability, but they can still be highly disruptive. Artificial intelligence would play a growing role in warfare. Autonomous weapons systems would become more common. The use of drones and other unmanned platforms would increase. The battlefield would become more technological. The future of warfare is uncertain. But one thing is clear: the use of nuclear weapons would have devastating consequences. We must find a way to prevent their use. The world stands at a crossroads. The path we choose will determine our fate. We can continue down the road to destruction, or we can choose a different path. We must find a way to eliminate nuclear weapons. This is the only way to guarantee our safety. We need a new global movement for nuclear disarmament. We must pressure our leaders to act. We must strengthen international institutions. The United Nations must play a central role. We need to promote dialogue and diplomacy. We must find peaceful solutions to our differences. The future of humanity depends on it. We must choose wisely. We must choose peace.